This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. Today I have a number of January birthdays of women, and also some death dates as well, but they are all of well-known women. So for January 1st, Maria Edgeworth, who is an English woman born in 1767. Now, she was a well-known author in her day. In fact, she was one of the first really successful women authors who published books, under her own name and so on, at a time when some women were being rather coy and modest about the fact that they were famous people who were authors. For the 2nd of January, this is a death date for Harriet Kezia Hunt. She died at age 69 in Massachusetts in 1875. Now this shows her as a rather substantial lady, along in years. She was actually the first real woman doctor. Now, she didn't have a professional MD from some college, because at the time she lived, women weren't being permitted to enter colleges for the most part, or medical schools. But by the time of her death in 1875, on the 2nd of January, more women had entered the profession, but she is considered the first one, and she died at age 69. She had been a school teacher, and eventually she received an honorary MD degree from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, but she never actually studied medicine in a college. She applied to enter the medical school at Harvard, but the men thought that that was a very bad idea to have any women around becoming professional doctors. And when she tried to enter Harvard, there was a riot among the male medical students, and she never actually, therefore, became a MD officially. But she was the first of a number of women, and she pointed out that might be a very good idea for some women to become doctors, that it would be good for modest women to actually meet with a woman doctor rather than a male doctor in order to be diagnosed and examined and the like. For January 3rd, we have a birthday of an American woman, Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker, and you see her in fact, probably all the pictures taken of her as an adult show her with a Quaker bonnet on, and this is definitely one of those. She was an early and very important feminist, Lucretia Mott. She got together with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They actually met at an abolitionist conference in England in 1840. And they said, we really ought to have sometime a movement which promotes women, per se. And about 8 years later, when Lucretia Mott was visiting in New York State, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived, they did get together, and they had the first women's meeting that we know of, the first famous women's meeting, was held in Seneca Falls, New York, in the summer of 1848. And Lucretia Mott was one of the people who organized that conference. For the 4th of January, we have a death date. This is of a woman who was a Russian woman. She was a very well-to-do person and a close friend of the Empress Catherine II of Russia. She was born in, or rather, pardon me, died, this is a death date. She died on January 4th, 1810, in Moscow. But as I said, she was quite a wealthy person at that time, and well known for her philanthropy, giving away money and helping the poor and the like. She, like I say, was a good friend of Catherine II, but they kind of fell out along the way because it turned out that, according to this book at any rate, that Dashkova, Ekaterina, which of course is the Russian word for Catherine, Katerina took up with Catherine II's favorite lover, it says here, and he was actually a Rimsky-Korsakov. Now, that's a well-known Russian name, you know, because there is a very well-known composer who lived much later, actually, named Rimsky-Korsakov. For the 5th of January, an American woman, again, an abolitionist, a feminist, an early, she was actually, her name was Olympia Brown, and she was the first woman in the United States to study theology with men. She went to Oberlin, I believe, and she was certainly the first to be ordained as a minister, a woman ordained as a minister. She was ordained by the Universalist denomination. And it says here that she had been a student also at Antioch College, which is definitely an Ohio institution, and had been inspired by an Ohio woman from Southeast Ohio, actually, someone that I've studied in the past, namely Frances Dana Gage, who was born in Washington County and became very well known as a promoter of abolition and also of women's rights. And Olympia Brown herself was a Universalist minister. She commented that when she heard Frances Dana Gage speak, that it was the first time that she'd heard a woman preach, and it lifted her up. It really inspired Olympia Brown, who became the first ordained woman minister in the United States. She was born in 1835 on the 5th of January. She was also a person who supported the American Civil Liberties Union. In fact, she was among the founding members, which would have been in quite her old age, because if I remember correctly, ACLU was founded about the early days of the 20th century in the 1900s. Now for January 6th, we have a death date, and this woman is Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell was a famous muckraker. Now, muckrakers were a nickname, actually, that were given to people who were very interested in the environment and in condemning people who hurt the environment and the like. And Ida Tarbell was certainly among those. She was also not at all in favor of John D. Rockefeller, the very famous person who founded the Standard Oil empire. But Ida Tarbell was someone who spoke out against the oil and gas interests, which especially at that time, like about 1905 or thereabouts, were not good, not well known for protecting the environment. They were just wanted to get out the oil and gas any way they could, and they didn't care about, of course, that was before global warming was something that had become a real threat. But global warming is caused by dioxides entering the atmosphere. And so the fact that Ida Tarbell was among those who opposed attacking the environment by putting up sulfides and so on into the air was quite an important thing. Now, interestingly, she thought that women should, she wasn't a feminist. She wrote a couple of books about women, but she did not embrace the feminist viewpoint, although she herself was a very enlightened woman and certainly spoke out and wrote and so forth. As a woman herself, she really thought that women's major work should be raising children, being a good wife, and so on. However, because she wanted herself to be able to work for the things that she was interested in full time, she never married. And so that was kind of interesting that she actually in her person portrayed a liberated woman, shall we say, but she praised the women who followed the more traditional line of being good wife and mother. For January 7th, Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was a black author, and she had an interesting life in that she at one time had been quite famous as an author, and she was part of the Harlem Renaissance, as it was called, in the 1920s when black authors came to the fore. But unfortunately, as she grew older, she fell into poverty. She had started her early work career as a maid because of her color and so on. But she fell back into that after her work was no longer being published and so on. And they say that she was buried in an unmarked grave. But Zora Neale Hurston, when she was at the top of her prime, was a very well-known author and quite successful. Her best-known book is called Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it is said to be rather an autobiographical account of herself and how she came from a black town in Florida. So she wasn't really, she didn't really feel racism where she grew up. It was only after she went to some of the big cities of the North and so on that she found that blacks were looked down upon and mistreated. But in her day, she was a famous author, Zora Neale Hurston. For the, also for the 7th of January, we have a very different woman who had brief fame. Her name was Jackie Mitchell. And if you'll notice, she's wearing a baseball uniform. She was, very briefly, a member of a male baseball team, but she was, of course, she had worked for a longer time with a female baseball team, Jackie Mitchell. And it was her death day, January 7th, about 1964, or rather 1987. She lived to as long as 1987, but the time that she was a famous pitcher was in the 1920s, and it is said that she struck out both Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. So she was obviously a very talented pitcher lady. For the 8th of January, we remember a woman who's assigned to the 8th of January because she lived so long ago, people didn't really know when she was born. She was born in the 4th century BC, actually. And she was someone who wanted to be a doctor, and eventually she was a doctor, but of course in the 4th century BC they didn't have colleges of medicine and so on. But basically all the official doctors were males. But she was very well known at her time in the 4th century BC, although they don't know her exact birth date, and they have assigned her to January 8th. And she was Greek. She wanted to be a doctor, and she did work as a medical practitioner, especially with women. For the 9th of January, Simone de Beauvoir, that's a birth date, January 9th, 1908 was the birth date of Simone de Beauvoir, a famous French author, born in Paris in 1908. She became, officially, she dropped out of her Catholic faith, but she continued to triumph the good ideas and the good morals that the Catholics promoted. And she wrote a book in 1953 called The Second Sex, which was about women. Yeah. Sometimes in the old days, actually, references to women were called references to the second sex, i.e., not males, the second sex. And it's, I have read it, but it's some years ago, and I can't quote it at length, or even briefly, I guess I should say. But it was quite popular in 1953 when it came out. It sort of mixes biology, psychoanalysis, literary criticism, mythology, history, anthropology, even philosophy, all together in that book, The Second Sex. So it's really a very interesting book. But it's not an easy read, that's for sure. Now, for the 10th of January, we have a death date. This was a death date in 1971 of Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel was a well-known woman who made popular and costly clothing for women, so that she was very, a woman who could claim that she had purchased and was wearing a Coco Chanel outfit was someone who was quite envied back in the middle of the last century. It says she died at 87, so she was around for a good long time and had been born in the 1880s. She, by 1912, she'd opened her own store making women's clothing, and she specialized in things that were easy to wear, that were, and simple, relatively simple, not all decorated up. The chemise dress, which is like a shirtwaist style of dress, that was her specialty. Also, a cardigan sweater without any collar. She popularized those, did Coco Chanel. And she was a well-known rival of Elsa Schiaparelli, who was also a fashion designer for women. But it says that she did come back in later life in the 1950s and was again popular and able to sell clothing that was pretty expensive. Miss Coco Chanel, who died in 1971. January 11th is the birth date of a famous American feminist. Her name, Alice Paul. Alice Paul founded the Women's Party. She founded a party specifically for women, and she was one of the women who were pressing for women to get the right to vote, which they finally got in 2020, thanks to the work of, starting with women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in 1848, but it was many, many years before women actually got the right to vote. And Alice Paul lived into the 1970s. She died as an elderly lady in her 90s in 1977, which was the year of the woman, and which I remember well because the first Women's Year was 1975 in Mexico City, and then we had Women's Year 1977 all across the United States. And I was one of the people who was working on the women's meeting that was held in June of 1977. Actually, Alice Paul passed away in the spring of 1977 when a lot of those women's meetings were being planned. Because she was born in 1885. She was over 90, as I mentioned, at the time of her death in the Women's Year of 1977. For the 12th of January, we have Marie Bashkirtsev, who was a Russian woman born in 1859. And I think we have a picture of Marie Bashkirtsev. She was an artist, and she died at only age 25, as you can see by the picture. She was quite a youthful woman, but she was already a well-known artist at the time of her death at age 25. She was born in 1859, so she died in the 1880s, but she, by the time of her death at only age 25, she had won quite a bit of attention as a woman artist. For the 13th of January, Ernestine Rose, who was born in Russian Poland in the year 1810. She was a rabbi's daughter, and she was a woman who was an early feminist, basically. She always was willing to buck tradition, although the picture we see of her shows her in very sort of dress and all that people would have been wearing in the middle of the 19th century, Ernestine Rose. But they consider her one of the outstanding, radically liberal women of the 19th century, Ernestine Rose. And she lived in America and was a proponent of woman suffrage and abolition and important liberal causes during her lifetime. It's said that she was particularly hurt by the fact that so many women kind of turned against her because of her radical ways. She complained to Susan B. Anthony about how women had scorned her and called her names and so on because she had been such an outspoken woman feminist. Ernestine Rose. For the 14th of January, Anais Nin, that's a death date in 73 of she died at age 73 in 1977. In other words, she was born about 1904. She had problems because of difficulties in her family life, actually. She first was traumatized by being quite ill when she was only 9 years old and being told by a doctor that she would probably never walk again. Now that did not turn out to be true of Anais Nin, but I'm hoping we have a picture of her, Anais Nin, for the 14th of January. We're still seeing a picture of Ernestine Rose. Matt? Okay, there we go. I knew she was a beautiful person, and she certainly didn't have 19th century curls like Mrs. Rose. But this is Anais Nin, who died at 73 in the year 1977, the Women's Year. She The other problem that she had as a child that affected her life was the separation of her parents when she was 11. And of course, that was quite, well, it was not unknown, but still it was pretty unusual. That would have been when she was 11, that would have been in 1914. And divorce was definitely not very common in that year. But anyway, she is best known for her diaries. She wrote diaries which were published and people found quite interesting reading because she was the sort of woman who did interesting things, met interesting people, and then wrote about it in her diary, and her diaries were published and quite popular. For the 15th of January, Sofia Kovalevskaya, born in 1850. Now, she was a professor of mathematics. She was a well-known woman scientist and mathematician, which was a very unusual thing, you know, for a woman to be outside the home in the 19th century was rather unusual in the first place, but to be a scientist and mathematician and professor was particularly unusual for her, born in 1850. She'd already studied physics, geometry, algebra, trigonometry, calculus, and biology by the time she was 18. So she was obviously a very gifted woman as a scientist and mathematician. So, for the 16th of January, we have Dorothy Eady, who was an English woman born in 1904, and she had a very strange beginning to her early years. In fact, she was so sick at one point. Here she looks fine, right? But she was so sick at one point as a small child, only age 3, that people thought she had died. You know, they sort of ran out of the room and said she's died and we have to go get the water to wash her and prepare her for her funeral. And when they came back, they discovered she was sitting up and hadn't died at all, which of course was a rather unusual experience for our childhood. Now, she claimed to be a reincarnated person. When she first went to the British Museum, she really got excited when she was taken to the Egyptian section of the museum. And you know, that's a place where they have plenty of mummy cases. I've been there, it was a long time ago, of course, but I certainly remember that they had many, many mummy cases around. Well, when Dorothy Eady was taken into that room with all those mummy cases, she got excited and she ran up to one of the mummy cases and began kissing the mummy case. And she claimed that she had known this person in ancient Egypt because she was reincarnated from ancient Egypt. So that's rather unusual, I guess, for any child. And that was, you know, when she was, well, it would have been about 1920, I suppose, by then that this happened. But she always wanted to go to Egypt, and finally she got her wish, and she never left. She went to Egypt, and she stayed right there. And she married an Egyptian and spent the rest of her life there. in Egypt. So she was one of the people who worked actually in the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, finally. She was an artist, and so she made pictures of some of the holdings that they had of Egyptian relics in the museum in Egypt. Now, for the 17th of January, we have Lola Montez. Lola Montez. She was a dancer, and I wish we had had a picture of her dancing, but we saw a number of nice pictures, but there weren't really any good pictures showing her dancing, so we show her pretty face instead. Now, she was born about 1820, and she was not, Lola Montez certainly sounds like a Spanish name or Mexican name, possibly. Well, she was actually the daughter of a British Army officer, and her name was Maria Dolores Gilbert. She was born in Ireland, but she took the stage name, shall we say, as of Lola Montez, and she was, as I said, a dancer and very well known in her own day in the 19th century. And she specialized in Spanish dance, but she wasn't Spanish. And she wound up marrying quite a wealthy Englishman that made her the Countess of Lansfield and the Baroness Rosenthal when she married a well-to-do man. And she also had a very famous liaison with King Ludwig of Bavaria. I guess that was in her days when she was touring Europe as a dancer. But Lola Montez was not Spanish, despite her name. Now, on that same day, the 17th of January, there's another birthday of a famous woman, and that's Catherine Booth. Catherine Booth, here we have a nice picture of her in her Salvation Army bonnet. She and her husband were the founders of the Salvation Army. And she was born in Derbyshire in England in 1829. And the Salvation Army people, you know, were famous for, and still are famous for, asking for money for charity and being on the streets. And so she met more than her share of people who threw mud at her and stuff like that because they thought that was something that she shouldn't be doing. But as a good member of the Salvation Army, she felt it was her duty to ask for alms for the poor. And as I say, she wore a bonnet like this as a Salvation Army lass. And actually, she, for a while, her husband was a well-known speaker, minister, speaker, and one day she asked if she could talk, and she was so successful in her preaching from the pulpit that she continued doing that and helping her husband specifically as another preacher to the end of her life. On the 18th of January, was born a woman called Valentina Grizodobova. She was born in Russia, and she was born in 1910, just shortly after the very first airplanes were flown by our friends, the Wright brothers of Ohio, in 1902. So she was only 8 years old when, born 8 years after the first airplanes were successfully flown. And she became a pilot. So we see her with her plane in Russia. And she was, these were during in the Soviet days when she grew up, of course. The Soviet Union was formed in 1918. And she became a well-known Soviet pilot and won awards for breaking records with her flying. So we show her as a hero of the Soviet Union and a winner of the Order of Lenin from the Soviets for being a famous woman pilot. In fact, she actually was made the head of the women's aviation in the Soviet Union, just about in time for the Second World War, 1939. For the 19th of January, there's a birth date in Port Arthur, Texas, in 1943 of Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin was a famous singer. She didn't have a very long life, actually. It says she died of a heroin overdose in 1970, but she was a famous singer in the 1950s and 60s. Janis Joplin, a Texan, born a Texan. She tried to get over alcoholism, but wasn't really successful at it. Like I say, finally died of a heroin overdose. But in the meanwhile, she had been a very famous entertainer and singer, Janis Joplin. Now, for the 20th of January, Joy Adamson. Joy Adamson was born in Czechoslovakia in 1910. She is shown here with a lion, right? Okay. She was, you might say, a lion tamer. And she wrote a book called Born Free about a lion cub. This is probably the grown-up lion that was once the cub that looked up to Joy Adamson as a source of goodies. But says that she tried acting in movies, but was not too good at that, or either that or the films that she appeared in didn't have very good stories to them or something, because she didn't really do well at it. She is associated often with Africa because of this interest in lions and working with lions in Africa. Now, for the 21st of January, we have a woman who's been assigned to the 21st of January because no one knows exactly when she was born and died, except that she, it says died in 1333, but that she was a lawyer, actually, in Italy, and her father had been a law professor also. So she entered that same trade in as long ago as 1333. Well, this is a little strange. this story because they give a couple of dates that don't match. But it does mention that she was such a beautiful woman, and despite the fact that she was giving lectures in law, the male students were so bewitched by her good looks that they didn't put down the right notes or something like that. Although she told them the real stories of that they needed to know for law, but she just had a problem with that. Now, for the 22nd of January, we have Victoria of England. Maybe some of you are watching the TV show on Victoria. And I chose a picture that shows her with her husband because she was, first of all, she was the mother of 9 children, and her husband died young, so she had those 9 children pretty early in her lifetime. She became Queen of England on the death of her father, who would have inherited the throne, but because he had died, she was the first queen in her own right since Elizabeth II. Elizabeth I, who was back in the 17th century. And Victoria of England. It's quite an interesting show. Maybe you're watching it, have been seeing it. It usually shows on Sunday evening on WOUB, Victoria of England, but it shows her there with her handsome, very beloved husband, Albert. And it says that after his early death, she slept with his nightshirt in her arms. And she had problems, obviously, you know, being the official queen and being sort of prostrated with grief for a time after her husband's death in 1851 or so, and she lived on until 1901 herself. But those 9 children that she had that were fathered by her husband Albert became kings and queens across Europe during the 19th century because they married well, and she got sure that they had good marriages when and if possible to another monarch, so that they were kings and queens in their own right. But that was kind of hard, having 9 children, you know, in about 12 years. She lived on. She always did her duty as Victoria, Queen of England, and was queen for almost 70 years. In fact, it's only very recently, it's only this year, that the current queen, Elizabeth II, has passed Victoria in time in office. She's in her 90s now, and she became queen when she was in her early 20s. So, of course, we've had Elizabeth II of England around for a very long time, and the crown prince is in his 70s by now also, so he probably won't be king very long, even if he survives his mother. The 23rd of January was a death date at age 93 in Massachusetts of Anne Whitney. Anne Whitney was a famous sculptor, and she made busts, mostly busts, rather than full-length figures of the people that she sculpted. But she sculpted Lucy Stone, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frances Willard, Harriet Martineau, Mary Livermore, and William Lloyd Garrison. Now there's a male that she did. Garrison was a famous abolitionist. But those other women were famous 19th century women. And Anne Whitney, of course, was an American. She died in 93 in the year 1915. So she was active during a large part of the 19th century. And that's how she got to sculpt all those well-known people. And it says that, this is an interesting one, she was hired to create a monument to a famous Boston male named Charles Sumner, who was in Congress at one point. But when they discovered that the sculptor was a woman, they didn't want to have this woman's made statue on the official monument for in Boston. So they put it up eventually in front of the Harvard Law School, which was a good place for it, no doubt. Charles Sumner. He was the one who was attacked in the by a slave owner when he was in Congress in the 1850s. The 24th of January is the birthday of Edith Wharton, famous author. And she was born in New York City in 1962. And she was a very popular author, actually, back in the day, and people are still reading Edith Wharton's work. She lived for a time in Paris, and she entertained people like André Gide and Aldous Huxley, Haussmann, Henry James, in France. So she lived for a time, quite a long time in France. In fact, during the Second World War, she didn't even leave France. And during the First World War, she'd done a lot of work for the French. The 25th is, of January is a famous English authoress, Virginia Woolf. Here's Virginia Woolf. She had a problem all during her lifetime with mental illness. She went in and out of mental illness. And in fact, finally, at the very end, she was, despite the fact that she was a very well-known and very popular author, she committed suicide when she felt that she was going again into the mental illness problem that she had had off and on for perhaps 20 or 30 years. Virginia Woolf, English author. Now, for the 26th of January, Bessie Coleman, a black lady who was as you can see, she's got a plane in her background, and she was a famous woman pilot. She was born in 1896, So she was already a little girl, old enough to go to school when the airplane was invented, shall we say. And she was a black woman, and she had problems getting trained as a pilot. I guess the males didn't really think that she was serious or something, but she eventually made it, and she was a good pilot, won awards and so on. For the 27th of January, Ellen Terry was a famous actress, born in 1847, and in the late 1870s, 80s, and so on, was well known. She traveled the world, and she traveled Europe as an actress. So she was definitely around in 1900 on the London stage. And on the 28th of January, we have Colette, Soderini Gabriella Colette, born in France in 1873. They say that she had long hair, so long. She had 5-foot-long braids at one point. Well, it still looks like she has pretty long hair there, but it's all wrapped up around her top. But she was she became a businesswoman, actually. She was selling products that were business, that made her a businesswoman, and when she finally bobbed her hair, cut off these long, long braids, she was among the first women to do such a thing, and among the first women to use, I imagine, cosmetics as well. So Colette was, my picture shows her with these 5-foot braids. Really weird. I don't know, I have long hair, as you may know, but my long hair never got any longer than about down my back, the middle of my back. And she had braids that apparently they never cut her hair at all except for her bangs. The 29th of January is the birthday of Germaine Greer, famous Australian woman born in 1939. And she's written, she's a famous author, and wrote shocking books. It says one of them is called The Mad Woman's Underclothes. And she also wrote The Female Eunuch. You know, the eunuchs are generally men, obviously, but Germaine Greer has had a successful author's time. On the 30th of January, that's the death date of Matilda, a queen of France. She was born in 1167. Oh, sorry, she died in 1167. So, but she was the mother of Henry I, the King of England. So we see her as in her queen's outfit from the 12th century. And finally, for the 31st of January, an American actress, Tallulah Bankhead. Her father was in Congress, but she became a very well-known actress. I remember seeing her long ago, and probably her most famous film was Lifeboat, which was made in the 1940s. But she was quite a popular actress for many years. Tallulah Bankhead. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.